The first step. Aisha clutched her paperwork in trembling hands as she took her first steps into Elmbridge Psychiatric Center. She hoped this would be a place of refuge, a sanctuary where she could escape the mental scars left by years of bullying, discrimination, and trauma. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead cast a cold glow, and the silence in the hallways was occasionally broken by distant cries or murmurs. With each step, her heartbeat grew louder, echoing in her mind as she took in the sterile, white-walled surroundings. Her journey to this place had been painful and solitary. She'd spent years being the target of others' insecurities, enduring relentless bullying in her school days, and later microaggressions in her workplace that wore her down to a breaking point. When the world around her felt like it was collapsing, a single thought sustained her. She had to find a way to feel whole again. Aisha's initial impression of Elmbridge was unnerving. She'd hoped for a warm, welcoming environment that could support her through the difficulties she faced. Instead, the place felt impersonal, more like a facility for containment than healing. Still, she held on to her hope that this place would offer her a chance to rebuild. As Aisha reached the admissions desk, a nurse approached her. Tall and stoic, Nurse Rita carried a clipboard and exuded an air of clinical efficiency. Her gaze swept over Aisha, evaluating her with a professionalism that bordered on indifference. "Name?" the nurse asked in a flat tone. "Aisha." "Welcome to Elmbridge," she replied without much warmth, scribbling notes as she ran through a series of questions. The formalities, combined with the nurse's detached demeanor, made Aisha feel like she was being processed rather than welcomed. She tried to mask her unease, but inside, a knot of anxiety tightened. Aisha's mind drifted back to the events that had brought her here. She remembered the hurtful words, the laughter at her expense, and the painful isolation she had felt in school and beyond. She thought of the cruel emails and the public shaming on social media from people she once thought were friends. Their words had made her feel small, worthless. Each day, the torment chipped away at her self-worth, until she could barely recognize the person in the mirror. Coming to Elmbridge was her last attempt to find help, to rediscover a piece of the person she once was. Aisha barely registered the nurse's instructions as she was led down a long hallway to her room. Her mind was scattered, caught between memories and present fears. The rooms she passed were shut tight, but she could hear muffled voices and the occasional cry or laugh from within. Each sound seemed to serve as a grim reminder of the collective pain held within these walls. When they reached her room, Nurse Rita gave her a cursory glance, then handed her a list of rules and guidelines. Meal times, therapy sessions, visitation hours. It all blurred together as Aisha skimmed the paper. She nodded mechanically, feeling the first sting of tears prick her eyes. "Someone will be by soon to go over your treatment plan," the nurse said, her tone softened just a bit as she prepared to leave. "Welcome to Elmbridge." Once alone, Aisha sank onto the bed, the weight of the day settling over her like a heavy blanket. She felt a flicker of despair creeping in as the reality of her situation took hold. This place was supposed to offer her peace, but everything about it felt like the beginning of another nightmare. Would this really be a place of healing, or was she simply going from one kind of confinement to another? The door opened with a soft knock, and a new nurse entered. This one was younger, with warm brown eyes and a gentle smile. "Hi, Aisha. I'm Nurse Sophia. I'll be your primary contact here." The warmth in Sophia's voice was like a balm to Aisha's frayed nerves. Despite her earlier misgivings, she felt a glimmer of relief. She wasn't entirely alone here. Sophia asked a few questions to get to know Aisha, listening attentively and offering a few encouraging words. Her presence was calming, and for the first time since arriving, Aisha felt a small thread of hope. As Sophia left, Aisha allowed herself a tentative smile. Maybe, just maybe, Elmbridge would be different. But as the night wore on, that flicker of hope was tested. Shadows in the light. Aisha lay awake in her small, sterile room, the soft hum of the air conditioner providing the only comfort in the otherwise chilling silence. The weight of the day's emotions still pressed on her chest, making it difficult to breathe easily. She closed her eyes, hoping sleep would bring some relief, but her mind replayed every moment of her arrival at Elmbridge, her fears mixing with memories of the bullying she had endured. Sleep felt distant and elusive. The following morning, Aisha forced herself to get out of bed, her limbs heavy as though weighed down by invisible chains. She brushed her hair, took a deep breath, and prepared herself for her first day of treatment. She reminded herself that she was here to heal, even if that journey felt daunting. She had to believe it was possible to rebuild from the fragments of herself that remained. Breakfast was served in a large dining hall that echoed with the clinking of utensils and murmurs of patients speaking in low voices. Aisha was unsure where to sit. She noticed clusters of patients who seemed familiar with each other, speaking quietly. As she scanned the room, her gaze landed on a corner table where a young woman with dark, curly hair sat alone, her gaze fixed on the table in front of her. Aisha decided to join her, hoping for some semblance of connection. "Hi, is this seat taken?" Aisha asked, her voice hesitant. The girl looked up, her dark eyes tired but kind. She offered a faint smile and gestured to the seat. "Not at all. I'm Tara." "Aisha," she replied, managing a small smile of her own. As they ate in comfortable silence, Aisha found herself comforted by the quiet company. Tara's presence seemed to offer an unspoken understanding, a bond between strangers who had both faced unseen battles. Their conversation remained sparse, but they exchanged a few brief words about life at Elmbridge. Tara explained that she'd been at the facility for nearly 2 months, and that despite its cold exterior, it had moments of warmth. "Some of the staff here genuinely want to help," she whispered, as though sharing a secret. "But you have to be careful. Not everyone is what they seem." Aisha nodded, digesting this cryptic warning. She didn't pry, sensing Tara's hesitation to elaborate. Part of her was curious, but another part of her wanted to remain hopeful that her stay at Elmbridge would bring the healing she so desperately needed. After breakfast, Aisha was guided to her first group therapy session by Nurse Sophia, who gave her an encouraging smile as they walked. The group therapy room was softly lit, with chairs arranged in a circle. Aisha took a seat and looked around at the other patients, each one seeming as weary and cautious as herself. The session was led by Dr. Elliot, a tall, soft-spoken therapist with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes. He introduced himself, explaining that group therapy was a safe space for everyone to share their thoughts and experiences. "This is a place where you can be heard," he assured them, his voice gentle yet firm. As the session began, one of the patients, a middle-aged man named Roger, spoke about the difficulty of opening up. His voice wavered as he shared fragments of his own painful journey, and Aisha felt a pang of empathy. When it was her turn, she hesitated, unsure if she could bring herself to speak. But then she felt Dr. Elliot's reassuring gaze and the patient silence of those around her. She took a deep breath and spoke softly. "I've been dealing with a lot of things," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I came here because I don't feel like myself anymore. Years of bullying, and well, other things, they've just taken pieces of me, and I'm not sure how to find those pieces again." Her words hung in the air, and she could feel the weight of her vulnerability pressing down on her. She expected the others to look away or dismiss her words, but instead, she was met with quiet nods and sympathetic glances. For the first time in what felt like forever, Aisha felt seen, even if only for a fleeting moment. As the group session continued, Aisha noticed Dr. Elliot's attentive gaze and warm encouragement, but there was something else she couldn't quite place. During the session, she also felt an odd tension from the staff observing through a glass window on the other side of the room. 2 nurses in white uniforms watched the patients with intense expressions, their eyes lingering on Aisha every so often. Aisha shifted in her seat, feeling a slight unease. After the session, she made her way back to her room. The hallways were eerily quiet, and as she walked, she heard faint murmurs and laughter from a few patients nearby. She passed a door that was slightly ajar and caught a glimpse of Nurse Sophia speaking to one of her colleagues, her voice low but urgent. "Are you sure she's stable enough to be here?" Sophia's voice sounded worried. "She'll have to adjust," the other nurse replied dismissively. "We don't have time to cater to everyone's needs individually. Just follow protocol." Aisha frowned, feeling an odd sense of dread creep over her. She wanted to brush it off, but something about the tone of their conversation lingered in her mind. She made her way back to her room and closed the door behind her, leaning against it as she tried to steady her racing heart. Later that evening, as she prepared for bed, a knock on the door made her jump. She opened it to find Nurse Rita standing in the hallway, her expression neutral but her gaze intense. "Tomorrow, you'll be starting a new treatment regimen," Rita informed her. "This will include some medications that might feel unfamiliar, but they are designed to help you adjust here and feel better." Aisha nodded, but her instincts told her something wasn't right. She had researched the medication she was currently taking, and the thought of starting new ones without a clear explanation felt unsettling. She wanted to ask more questions, but Nurse Rita's stern demeanor discouraged her. That night, as Aisha lay in bed, doubts began to creep into her mind. Elmbridge was supposed to be a place of healing, but the tension she had sensed and the cryptic words from Nurse Sophia and Tara filled her with unease. She wondered if there was more to this place than she had initially thought. The next morning, Nurse Rita administered the new medication as promised. As Aisha swallowed the pills, she felt a strange heaviness settle over her. Her thoughts grew muddled, and a dull, hazy fog clouded her mind. The hours blurred together, and she found herself struggling to stay awake. Conversations around her sounded muffled, as though she were underwater. She barely made it through the day, her body and mind growing increasingly sluggish. At lunch, she tried to tell Tara about her discomfort, but the words felt thick and heavy on her tongue. Tara's face twisted with concern as she watched Aisha's labored attempts to communicate. "Just be careful," Tara whispered, glancing around nervously. "If something feels off, trust your instincts. Not everything here is as it seems." That night, Aisha lay in her bed, her thoughts clouded and heavy. She wanted to believe Elmbridge was a safe place, but her instincts told her otherwise. A strange, lurking fear began to settle in her chest, and she realized that the journey she had embarked on might be far more complex and dangerous than she had anticipated. As her mind drifted into an uneasy sleep, one thought echoed in her mind. Was Elmbridge truly a place of healing, or was there something darker hiding within its walls? Unveiling the darkness, Aisha awoke the next morning feeling groggy, her head pounding as if she'd barely slept. The effects of the new medication weighed on her mind, making her feel more like a prisoner in her own body than a patient on the path to healing. She forced herself out of bed, her steps unsteady, and splashed cold water on her face in a desperate attempt to clear the fog in her head. As she stared at her reflection, she hardly recognized herself. Her eyes looked hollow, and her skin was paler than she remembered. The scheduled morning group therapy session felt like a mountain to climb, but Aisha knew she had to go. She didn't want to draw attention to herself by missing it, especially after noticing the quiet scrutiny from the staff. She had sensed that they were watching her more closely than other patients, though she couldn't understand why. As she walked into the therapy room, she spotted Tara and quickly took a seat beside her. Tara gave her a small, reassuring nod, though her own eyes looked tired and cautious. Today, Dr. Elliot wasn't leading the group. Instead, Nurse Rita stood at the front of the room, clipboard in hand, her expression blank yet stern. "Dr. Elliot is away today," she announced, her voice flat and uninviting. "I'll be leading today's session in his absence." The atmosphere in the room shifted, a palpable unease settling over the group. Aisha glanced around and noticed that several other patients seemed equally uncomfortable, some even fidgeting or looking down to avoid eye contact with Nurse Rita. She felt her pulse quicken, the feeling of apprehension from the previous night intensifying. One by one, Patients began to share their experiences, though today's session seemed different. Rather than creating a safe, open space, Nurse Rita's questions felt invasive, almost prying. When it was Aisha's turn, she hesitated, unsure of how much she wanted to reveal. "Aisha, we'd love to hear about your journey," Nurse Rita said, her tone sickly sweet yet her gaze piercing. "Tell us about what brought you here and what you hope to achieve during your time at Elmbridge." Aisha's throat tightened, the words lodged in her chest. She felt as though she was being put on trial, her vulnerabilities exposed under Nurse Rita's cold, scrutinizing gaze. Taking a deep breath, she spoke slowly, choosing her words carefully. "I came here because I needed to find a way to feel whole again. I've been through a lot," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted to be somewhere safe, somewhere that could help me heal." "Interesting," Nurse Rita replied, an odd glint in her eye. "But safety is a relative concept, isn't it? Sometimes facing our discomfort is the only way to heal." The statement hung in the air, its ambiguity unsettling. Aisha felt a chill run down her spine. Something about Nurse Rita's words felt almost like a threat. As the session ended, Tara caught up with Aisha in the hallway, her expression tense. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Aisha nodded, but the doubt was clear in her eyes. "Something about this place doesn't feel right, Tara. I thought I came here to heal, but I feel like I'm being washed. And this new medication, it's making everything blurry, like I'm not even myself." Tara glanced around to ensure no one was listening before leaning in close. "You're not alone in feeling that way. I don't want to scare you, but some of the staff here, they don't seem to have our best interests at heart." Aisha's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" Tara sighed, her face conflicted. "I've heard things. Patients sometimes disappear for a few days, supposedly for intensive therapy, but they come back looking worse, not better. And some of the nurses, like Rita, they seem to enjoy seeing us suffer." The words echoed in Aisha's mind, fueling her suspicions. She recalled Nurse Rita's cold demeanor, her probing questions, and the way her eyes had lingered on Aisha during therapy. She shivered, suddenly feeling very exposed. That evening, after her prescribed medication, Aisha lay in bed, her mind swimming. She felt trapped, as though invisible walls were closing in around her. The fog from the medication made her thoughts sluggish, but a nagging feeling in the back of her mind kept her alert. She couldn't shake Tara's warning from earlier. Desperate for answers, Aisha decided to fight the haze clouding her thoughts. She sat up in bed and took a shaky breath, summoning the courage to act. Carefully, she opened her bedside drawer, where Nurse Rita had placed her schedule and medication list. She examined the list, squinting to make out the names of the medications written in unfamiliar, scrawling handwriting. 2 of the medications were new, one she hadn't been prescribed before her arrival at Elmbridge. Determined, Aisha slipped out of her room and quietly made her way down the dimly lit hallway toward the nursing station. She felt like an intruder, her heart pounding as she crept closer, hoping no one would see her. The station was deserted, and the nurses on duty were down the hall, their backs turned as they chatted in low voices. Aisha took the opportunity to scan the files on the desk. Her hand shook as she flipped through the papers, her eyes quickly scanning for her own records. Finally, she found her chart. The medications listed were unfamiliar, but one name stood out: Almazine. She remembered reading about it briefly before. It was known for heavy sedative effects and was often used in extreme cases of psychosis. But she wasn't psychotic. She had come to Elmbridge for anxiety and trauma, not for something that required this level of sedation. A cold realization dawned on her. They weren't treating her for recovery. They were controlling her, subduing her. Before she could process the full weight of her discovery, she heard footsteps approaching. Heart racing, she quickly placed the files back and hurried down the hallway, slipping back into her room just as the footsteps grew louder outside. She lay in bed, feigning sleep as a nurse passed by, peeking into her room before moving on. Aisha's heart hammered as she listened to the nurse's footsteps fade down the hallway. The following morning, Aisha awoke groggier than ever, her mind struggling to keep pace with her thoughts. Her encounter with Nurse Rita and her discovery about the medication weighed heavily on her. She needed to talk to someone, anyone who might listen. She thought of Nurse Sophia, whose warmth and kindness had been a rare comfort during her early days here. After breakfast, Aisha found Nurse Sophia in a quiet corner of the facility. She approached cautiously, hoping she could trust her. "Sophia," she whispered, her voice thick with desperation. "I need to talk to you. I think something's wrong with my treatment plan. They're giving me these medications that don't feel right. I'm not supposed to be on such strong sedatives." Sophia's face softened with concern, her brows knitting together as she glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Aisha, I understand your concern, but the medication plan is put together by the doctors based on their evaluations. You know that. I get that," Aisha insisted, her voice shaking. "But I looked at my records, and some of these medications, they don't make sense for my condition." Sophia's expression shifted, her gaze darting nervously down the hallway. She sighed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Aisha, I don't know if I can help. Some things in this place, they're beyond what I can control." Aisha's heart sank. "Please, Sophia, I don't know who else to turn to." Sophia looked conflicted, glancing over her shoulder once more before leaning in close. "Listen," she whispered urgently. "If you feel that something's wrong, keep records of it. Write down how you feel each day, the side effects, everything. There are some people who would want to know if something unethical is happening here." Aisha nodded, clinging to this shred of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. That night, she started her own journal, carefully documenting every detail of her experiences, every sensation, and every word that felt wrong. As the days passed, she recorded the strange behaviors of Nurse Rita and the unsettling incidents she witnessed with other patients. Slowly, Aisha's journal became her lifeline, her only way of making sense of the strange, foreboding events at Elmbridge. She felt her strength growing as she put pen to paper each night, her words a quiet rebellion against the shadow that loomed over her. And although the future was uncertain, Aisha's resolve was set. She would gather evidence, she would be vigilant, and she would find a way to uncover the truth, even if it meant risking everything to expose the darkness within Elmbridge's walls. The thin veil of trust. Aisha's journal entries became her sanctuary in the days that followed, her only way to hold on to a sense of reality. The fog induced by the sedatives lingered, but her daily notes allowed her to piece together the disjointed moments of her life at Elmbridge. She began to see patterns in the behavior of the staff, especially Nurse Rita, and a few others who seemed to follow her every move with cold, assessing eyes. Each morning, Aisha forced herself to rise, go through the motions, and try to maintain a facade of compliance. Inside, however, she was alert, her mind racing with every suspicious glance, every cryptic word from the staff, and every uneasy interaction with Nurse Rita. One day, she caught sight of a new face in the facility, a man who seemed out of place with his expensive suit and polished demeanor. He had an air of authority that set him apart from the other staff members. The other nurses treated him with an almost reverent respect, nodding and stepping aside as he walked past. Aisha caught a glimpse of his name badge. Dr. Conrad Halstead, Chief Psychiatrist. Dr. Halstead didn't directly interact with the patients. He seemed more preoccupied with paperwork and private discussions with the staff. Aisha observed him from a distance, her instincts flaring with curiosity. She couldn't explain why, but something about him unsettled her, as if he held knowledge of secrets she wasn't supposed to know. Later that day, as Aisha was returning from a solitary walk in the courtyard, she noticed Dr. Halstead in deep conversation with Nurse Rita and another nurse she hadn't met before. They were speaking in low tones, but the occasional word drifted her way. Increased dose. Compliance. No deviations. Aisha slowed her pace, feigning interest in a patch of flowers nearby as she strained to listen. The conversation continued, but she couldn't catch enough to piece it together. However, her suspicions deepened. Compliance. Deviations. Were they discussing her or other patients? And if so, why the secrecy? That evening, after taking her medication and enduring the usual wave of sluggishness that followed, Aisha opened her journal. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrote down her observations about Dr. Halstead and the conversation she'd overheard. She jotted down her questions and fears, knowing that if anyone discovered her journal, her one lifeline would be gone. The following morning, she was surprised to see Nurse Sophia waiting by her door. The nurse had been distant lately, avoiding prolonged interactions as if fearful of attracting attention. But today, she appeared resolute, though her eyes darted around the hallway with nervous energy. "Can we talk?" Sophia whispered, motioning for Aisha to follow her. Aisha nodded, her pulse quickening. She followed Sophia to a small, unused storage room down the hallway. Once inside, Sophia locked the door and took a deep breath, as though gathering the courage to speak. "Aisha," Sophia began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to say. I shouldn't even be telling you this, but I can't ignore what's happening here any longer." Aisha's heart raced, her hands clutching the edges of her sleeves. She had been waiting for someone to acknowledge her suspicions, and here it was, the truth she had feared and anticipated. "What's going on, Sophia?" Aisha asked, her voice trembling. Sophia looked down, her face clouded with guilt. "There are practices here that aren't ethical, things I'm not supposed to question. Dr. Halstead has introduced certain protocols that he claims are for the patient's benefit, but I don't believe it. Patients are being over-medicated, kept sedated, and isolated. It's like they want to control us more than they want to help us." Aisha's eyes widened. "Then why are you still here? Why hasn't anyone reported this?" Sophia sighed, her shoulders slumping. "It's not that simple. Elmbridge is funded by a private organization that holds a lot of power. They provide us with generous funding, state-of-the-art equipment, and high salaries. Most of the staff here are either too afraid to question the practices, or they're part of it." "Part of what?" Aisha pressed, her voice barely a whisper. Sophia glanced away, hesitating. "I don't know everything, but I've heard rumors about some experimental treatments, methods they're testing on vulnerable patients without proper consent. Dr. Halstead claims it's all legal, that the patients sign away certain rights when they're admitted, but I can't ignore what I see every day." Aisha's stomach turned. She had known something was wrong, but to hear it confirmed made her feel as though the walls were closing in around her. "Then why are you telling me this?" Aisha asked, her voice laced with desperation. "What can I even do?" Sophia placed a trembling hand on Aisha's shoulder. "I don't know, Aisha, but if you keep documenting everything, maybe one day, when you're out of here, you'll have enough to expose them. I'll help you in any way I can, but we have to be careful. They're watching everyone, and if they suspect anything, they won't hesitate to silence us." Aisha nodded, her throat tight with fear and determination. "Thank you, Sophia. I won't forget this." Before they left the storage room, Sophia pressed a small, unmarked pill bottle into Aisha's hand. "This is a sedative replacement. If you take one of these instead of the medication they're giving you, you'll stay more alert. But only use it when you really need to. If they notice you're not compliant, they might escalate things." Aisha felt a surge of gratitude and apprehension as she slipped the bottle into her pocket. She knew the risk Sophia was taking by giving her the pills, and she was determined not to let her trust go to waste. Over the next few days, Aisha carefully alternated between the pills Sophia had given her and the prescribed sedatives, hoping to avoid suspicion. Each night, she continued to document her experiences, her thoughts becoming clearer as the sedative fog lifted, if only briefly. One evening, as Aisha lay in bed, she heard faint footsteps outside her door. She stiffened, her heart pounding as she watched the shadow under the door shift. The handle jiggled slightly, but the door didn't open. The footsteps retreated and silence returned, but Aisha lay awake, her body tense and alert. The next day, during group therapy, Aisha noticed Dr. Halstead observing the session from behind the glass window. He watched her intently, his gaze sharp and calculating. She forced herself to look away, pretending not to notice him. But inside, she felt a growing sense of dread. After the session, she went to her room, closing the door and taking deep breaths to calm her racing heart. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched more closely, as if Dr. Halstead suspected her of something. In the days that followed, Aisha's interactions with Nurse Rita grew increasingly tense. Rita seemed to sense a change in Aisha, her eyes narrowing whenever they crossed paths. She started making excuses to spend more time in Aisha's room, her presence an unspoken threat. One evening, as Aisha prepared for bed, Nurse Rita entered her room without knocking, a clipboard in hand. "Aisha," she began, her tone icy. "We've noticed some inconsistencies in your behavior lately. Are you feeling all right?" Aisha forced herself to remain calm, her mind racing. "I'm fine," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just adjusting, I guess." Nurse Rita's gaze lingered on her, a slight smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "Good. We wouldn't want any unnecessary complications. Compliance is key to your recovery." With those words, Rita left, closing the door behind her. Aisha exhaled, her chest tight with fear. She knew that Rita's words were a warning, a reminder that she was under constant surveillance. As the days passed, Aisha's resolve only strengthened. She continued her journal, documenting every detail with meticulous care. She watched the interactions between patients and staff, noting the instances where others were subdued, their spirits dulled by the drugs and the oppressive routines of Elmbridge. In the quiet moments of the night, Aisha would read her own entries, reminding herself of the truth, holding on to the hope that someday someone would believe her. But each passing day brought new challenges, new fears, and the creeping realization that time was running out. Dr. Halstead's gaze, Nurse Rita's threats, and the eerie silence that permeated the hallways weighed heavily on her. Yet beneath her fear, a flicker of courage remained, a small defiant ember that refused to be extinguished. Aisha clung to that courage as she continued to document her journey, her words a silent rebellion, a fragile hope that one day the truth would come to light. A desperate plan. Days passed in a blur of caution and watchfulness, every small victory for Aisha feeling like a high-stakes maneuver in a twisted game. Her careful balance of sedatives and substitute pills was beginning to fray. She could sense Nurse Rita's suspicions mounting, feel Dr. Halstead's calculating gaze whenever he observed her in group therapy, and even Sophia seemed more anxious as she passed in the hallways, offering Aisha only quick nods instead of quiet encouragement. Aisha's journal had grown thick with observations, not only of her own experience, but also of the interactions she saw between staff and patients. She documented incidents where other patients were reprimanded for speaking up, where medications were administered with an almost forceful hand, and moments when patients returned from intensive therapy sessions looking dazed and worse off. Yet, no one else seemed willing or able to acknowledge what was happening to them. One afternoon, as Aisha sat alone in the corner of the courtyard, Tara approached her. The two had become friends of sorts, bound by the unspoken recognition of fear and mistrust within the hospital walls. Aisha motioned her over, eager to have someone to talk to openly, even if only in whispers. "I need to find a way to contact someone outside," Aisha murmured, her voice barely audible over the rustling of leaves. "Someone who can help. I don't think I'll last much longer like this." Tara's eyes widened, flicking nervously toward the door leading back inside. "Are you serious? If they catch you, they'll transfer you to isolation or worse. I've seen it happen before. They don't let us out of here without a fight." Aisha's jaw clenched. She knew the risks, but she couldn't stay silent any longer. She felt her journal wasn't enough, not on its own. She needed someone beyond these walls who could expose Elmbridge's twisted practices, someone who could protect her and others like her. Isn't there any way? She pressed. A payphone nearby, an old landline. We just need one call. Tara looked down, wringing her hands as if wrestling with her own doubts. After a moment, she leaned closer. There might be a way, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. I overheard a nurse talking about a storage room on the 3rd floor that they sometimes use for maintenance work. There's an old phone there, one they use to call supply vendors. But it's risky. You'd have to get past the night staff, and if they find you. Aisha took a deep breath, her mind racing. It was a dangerous plan, but it was a chance, the only chance she'd had since arriving. She placed a hand on Tara's shoulder, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, Tara. I know the risk. I don't want to drag you into this, but if I can get out of here, I'll make sure people hear about what's happening. Tara nodded, though her face was pale. Just be careful, Aisha. Don't get caught. The two parted ways, and Aisha spent the rest of the day laying low, avoiding any unnecessary interactions with the staff. She feigned the effects of the sedatives, slumping her shoulders and keeping her head down, hoping to give them a false sense of her compliance. By nightfall, she'd formed a loose plan. Wait until the late shift took over, then sneak up to the 3rd floor, find the storage room, and make the call. That night, as the sounds of shuffling footsteps and faint murmurs faded down the hall, Aisha slipped out of bed. Her heart pounded as she quietly opened her door and peered into the hallway. It was dimly lit, empty. She took a steadying breath, then began to move, her steps as silent as she could manage. Each creak of the floorboards made her flinch, and every shadow seemed to stretch and twist with foreboding. As she reached the staircase to the 3rd floor, she hesitated, listening for any sign of approaching staff. Satisfied that she was alone, she ascended, each step tightening the knot of fear in her chest. Finally, she reached the 3rd floor. The hallway was dark, the only light a faint glow from an emergency exit sign at the end. She walked slowly, reading each door she passed until she found the one marked Maintenance Storage. With a trembling hand, she turned the handle and slipped inside. The room was cramped, filled with boxes and cleaning supplies, its air thick with the scent of chemicals. And there, against the wall, she saw it, a dusty, old landline phone mounted on the wall, its receiver hanging slightly askew. She rushed to it, hands shaking as she lifted the receiver. For a moment, she froze, the enormity of what she was about to do settling over her. She only had one shot. She dialed the emergency number, her heart thundering as she held her breath, praying that someone would answer. After 2 rings, a calm voice spoke. 911. What's your emergency? Aisha's breath caught in her throat, the weight of her fear nearly choking her. She forced herself to speak, her voice a panicked whisper. Please, you have to help me. My name is Aisha Daniels, and I'm at Elmbridge Psychiatric Center. They're holding us here against our will. They're over-medicating us, isolating us, using experimental drugs. Please, you have to send someone. Before she could finish, a sharp sound behind her made her whip around. Nurse Rita stood in the doorway, her face twisted with fury, her eyes blazing. Aisha's heart dropped as Rita stormed forward, her hand reaching to rip the phone from her grasp. Hand it over, Aisha. Rita hissed, her tone venomous. You've been causing trouble long enough. Aisha held onto the receiver, her voice growing frantic as she spoke into the line. Please, just send someone. We're in danger here. Rita yanked the receiver from her hand, slamming it back into its cradle. Her eyes flashed with rage, and before Aisha could react, Rita's hand shot out, grabbing her arm with a bruising grip. You think you can call for help? She sneered. We'll see how compliant you are after a little time in isolation. Aisha's pulse raced with terror as Rita dragged her from the room, her grip unyielding. She tried to struggle, but Rita's hold only tightened. As they moved down the hallway, Rita's tone shifted, her words laced with a chilling calm. "You've been causing quite a stir, Aisha. Dr. Halstead warned us about patients like you, those who think they can outsmart the system. I'm afraid it's time to teach you some discipline." Aisha's mind spun with fear and despair, but beneath it all, a flicker of hope remained. She had made the call. Someone had heard her plea. Even if she was punished, there was a chance that help would come. Rita dragged her down a seldom-used corridor, past rows of locked doors, until they reached a small, windowless room. A single dim light flickered above, casting eerie shadows over the walls. She unlocked the door and shoved Aisha inside, her voice low and menacing. "Consider this your new home until you learn to follow the rules," she spat, slamming the door shut and locking it behind her. Aisha stumbled forward, her knees hitting the cold concrete floor. She heard the click of the lock and Rita's footsteps fading down the hallway, leaving her alone in the darkness. She struggled to steady her breathing, the oppressive silence pressing in on her. She felt trapped, her fear creeping up her spine, the shadows in the small room seeming to close in around her. But even as despair threatened to consume her, she clung to the knowledge that she had reached out. She had called for help, and there was a chance that someone would come, that the horrors within Elmbridge would finally be exposed. Hours passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Aisha's body ached from the cold floor, and her mind grew hazy with exhaustion. She didn't know how long she'd been locked away, but every sound outside the door made her pulse quicken, each footstep sparking a fragile hope. Finally, after what felt like an endless stretch of silence, she heard voices echoing down the hallway, the clattering of keys followed by the sound of a door opening. And then, her door unlocked. The blinding glare of a flashlight filled the room as two figures entered. Aisha blinked, her eyes adjusting to the sudden light. One of the figures crouched beside her, a woman with a kind face and a badge on her chest that read Officer Price. "Are you Aisha Daniels?" the officer asked gently. Aisha nodded, her throat tight with relief. Tears welled in her eyes as she struggled to speak. "Yes, please, you have to help us. They're hurting us." Officer Price placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now, Aisha. We're here to help." Behind her, other officers moved down the hallway, their voices filling the once silent corridors. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Aisha felt a surge of hope, her body relaxing as the weight of fear began to lift. As the officers led her out of the room, she caught a glimpse of Dr. Halstead and Nurse Rita, both standing in the main hallway with expressions of shock and indignation as they were questioned by the police. Rita's eyes met Aisha's, her gaze filled with fury, but Aisha no longer cared. She knew she was no longer alone. As she stepped into the bright lights of freedom, the air felt fresh and clean, washing away the suffocating darkness that had surrounded her. Elmbridge's walls, once a fortress of despair, were now exposed to the light of justice. And though her journey was far from over, Aisha knew that she had found her voice, and she would use it to ensure that the truth would never be silenced again. A new beginning. The days that followed felt surreal to Aisha. She sat in a small office at the precinct, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea as officers and investigators filtered in and out, gathering her statements and the documentation she had kept in her journal. She pored over her notes with them, explaining every incident she'd recorded, every suspicion, every silent fear she'd endured at Elmbridge. Each word felt like a release, like she was lifting a crushing weight off her chest. But as liberating as it was to finally speak her truth, the memories were still raw, and a part of her worried that justice wouldn't come soon enough, or that Elmbridge would find a way to protect itself. She had heard the whispers about the institution's powerful backers, the ones who funded its activities and turned a blind eye to its practices. Would these shadowy benefactors use their influence to sweep everything under the rug? One evening, as she finished recounting her experiences to a detective named Officer Malik, he set his pen down and looked at her with an understanding gaze. "Listen, Aisha," he said, his tone gentle yet firm. "You've done something incredibly brave here. We've reviewed your journal, and we're working on building a case. You're not alone in this. There's already a growing interest from advocates, journalists, even politicians who want answers." Aisha nodded, a flicker of hope in her chest, but doubt still lingered. "Do you really think they'll face consequences?" Officer Malik's expression softened. "They will," he assured her. "But we need to keep the pressure on. Your voice will help make that happen." Aisha didn't fully understand the reach of her story until a few days later, when she was transferred to a safe place, a small private rehabilitation center for trauma survivors, where she could continue her recovery. The atmosphere there was everything she had hoped for at Elmbridge: warm, safe, and supportive. She met with a therapist named Dr. Jameson, who had a calm presence and a genuine empathy that put her at ease. In their first session, he encouraged her to share her story, but at her own pace. "I know you've been through a lot," he said, his voice reassuring. "Here, you're safe, and we'll go at your speed." It was there, in those quiet moments, that Aisha began to piece herself back together. She spent hours talking with Dr. Jameson, recounting her experiences and learning to unravel the trauma she'd endured. They worked through her fears, her anxieties, and her memories of Elmbridge. Slowly, she began to trust herself again, realizing that the doubts Nurse Rita and Dr. Halstead had sown within her were a distortion of her reality, not the truth. The support extended beyond the center's walls. News of the Elmbridge investigation had spread, capturing national attention. Journalists began reaching out, eager to hear her story. Her case had sparked a wave of outrage and support on social media, where survivors of similar situations began to share their own experiences. Elmbridge had become a focal point in a larger conversation about institutional abuse and the dark underbelly of the mental health industry. One afternoon, a woman named Carla Thompson, a well-known advocate for patient rights, arrived at the center to meet with Aisha. Carla had been instrumental in pushing for reform in psychiatric care and had heard about Aisha's case. She introduced herself with a warm smile and a firm handshake, her eyes filled with respect. "Aisha, I can't thank you enough for what you've done," Carla said, sitting across from her. "I know it took unimaginable courage to speak out. You're inspiring people who have felt silenced for years." Aisha felt a blush rise to her cheeks, still not used to the idea of her story reaching so many people. I just wanted to be heard," she admitted. "No one should have to go through what I went through at Elmbridge." Carla nodded, her expression grave. "We're working to make sure no one ever has to again. Your testimony is powerful, and it's already setting things in motion. We're seeing a call for stricter regulations, more oversight, and greater accountability for facilities like Elmbridge." The words sank in slowly, but as they did, a new feeling blossomed within Aisha, one of purpose. She realized that her story could become a tool, not just for her own healing, but to help others avoid similar pain. In the following weeks, Aisha joined Carla and her team in efforts to raise awareness about the realities of mental health facilities and the rights of patients. She attended town hall meetings, speaking to crowds with a newfound confidence that surprised even her. She shared her story on panels, in interviews, and with legislators who were drafting new bills aimed at enforcing patient protections. Each time she told her story, the fear and trauma grew less powerful, their grip on her loosening with each word. Her voice, once stifled by Elmbridge's oppressive walls, was now reaching ears that cared, people who wanted to ensure that no institution could ever silence or abuse their patients again. Then came the day when Aisha was asked to testify before a congressional committee investigating abuses in psychiatric institutions. The invitation was both an honor and a daunting prospect. Standing in front of lawmakers, recounting her experiences to the nation, felt overwhelming. But as she prepared her statement, she remembered the patients she'd left behind at Elmbridge. Their haunted eyes, their silent suffering. On the day of her testimony, Aisha wore a simple dress, her journal tucked into her bag. When her name was called, she rose and walked to the podium, her heart pounding but her mind focused. The room was silent as she opened her journal and began to read, her voice steady and unwavering. She recounted everything, how she'd come to Elmbridge seeking refuge, only to find herself trapped in a nightmare of forced medications, isolation, and constant surveillance. She described the staff's cruelty, Dr. Halstead's experiments, and the fear that had haunted her every step. "Elmbridge took away my voice," she said, her words echoing in the stillness. "They treated me like an object, not a person. But I'm standing here today to say that I won't be silent anymore. And I'm speaking for everyone else who's been hurt by the institutions that were supposed to protect them." When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Aisha stood there, her eyes brimming with tears, but her heart steady, her voice unbreakable. She had faced her darkest fears and emerged stronger, her story now a beacon for others still trapped in silence. In the months that followed, new laws were passed, and Elmbridge was shut down, its administrators and key staff members, including Dr. Halstead and Nurse Rita, brought to trial. The institution that had once held her captive was now the subject of scrutiny and investigation, its legacy dismantled by the voices of those who had once been silenced. As Elmbridge's dark chapter came to a close, Aisha embraced her new life as an advocate and speaker. She continued to share her journey, not only to raise awareness, but to connect with others who needed to hear that healing was possible. She spoke at universities, conferences, and support groups, her voice resonating with those who had once felt alone in their struggles. One evening, after a particularly powerful event, Aisha sat alone in her small apartment, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She picked up her journal, flipping through the pages filled with her most painful memories. But as she read her words, she no longer felt fear or sorrow. Instead, she felt a quiet strength, a deep understanding of how far she had come. A soft knock on her door broke her reverie. She opened it to find Carla standing there, holding a small bouquet of flowers and a warm smile. "I thought I'd stop by to celebrate," Carla said, stepping inside. "You've done incredible work, Aisha. The world is already better for it." Aisha smiled, her heart full as she accepted the flowers. "Thank you, Carla, for believing in me and for helping me believe in myself." Carla reached out and placed a gentle hand on Aisha's shoulder. "The truth is, Aisha, you were always strong. Elmbridge may have tried to take that away from you, but look at you now. You're proof that no darkness can ever silence a light that refuses to be extinguished." Aisha's eyes filled with tears as she embraced Carla, feeling the warmth and peace that she had thought she would never feel again. She knew her journey wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt whole, her voice her own, her future a blank page filled with infinite possibilities. As the evening wore on, Aisha sat by her window, looking out at the stars. She thought of everyone she'd met, every hand that had reached out to lift her up. She thought of the patients at Elmbridge, those who were still struggling, and she vowed to keep fighting for them.